So our next speaker is Kyla Bruff, known to most of us here, but I'll introduce her again. She is a specialist in German philosophy um, from Schelling to Adorno. She works at Carleton University as an associate professor, graduated from here with a co-tutelle at the University of Freiburg some years ago, has done lots of work in Germany, is fluent in multiple languages, and is now working on publishing her manuscript from her dissertation, which is on the late Schelling's political philosophy. But today we're going into a bit of a different world well, I suppose it is related. Schelling and Adorno on nature in the wake of the ecological crisis. Over to you.
Thank you. Clip this on. Thanks, Sean, for that introduction and for all your amazing organizational work, Barry and Joachim as well, and all of you for being here. Thank you very much. It is a hard task to speak right after an amazing sandwich pasta lunch. However, I promise I'll try my best to keep this sort of lively and as interesting as I think it is, which is pretty damn interesting. Okay, so let's get right into it. Oh, my slides are not changing, so that's not good. Oh, there we are. All right. So the debate surrounding the ontological status of nature is not new, yet it resurfaces repeatedly in philosophical interrogations of, and even in everyday conversations about, the roots of the ecological crisis. At its core lies the question of whether nature exists independently or in excess of human concepts and society, and if so, how it can be thought or accessed. This question concerns whether we regard nature as a product of discourse in society or as pre-subjective, and therefore, in some sense, both as grounding the human being's existence and yet also as other or prior to it. The latter position, which I will defend, has two potentially normative implications. And I do encourage you to look at the slides because everything I'm saying is kind of summarized there, and I hope it'll serve as an anchor for this kind of complex bringing together of Schelling and Adorno that I'm about to do. Perhaps before I move to implication one there, I will just say that we're entering a different key when we enter into a talk that deals with Adorno and critical theory than the key we've been in with the German Romantics. But as you can see, I've kept Schelling as part of this presentation. And this is to show what it does when you put someone as so heavily critical as Adorno into dialogue with somebody who's so speculatively affirming as Schelling. So that kind of explains why now, especially for like those of you who don't have so much philosophy in the room, you'll hear a shift to me talking in a really careful, critical key about the existence of nature beyond the human at all. It's a classical critical theory problem, especially Frankfurt School critical theory. So the implications of what I'm defending today. So firstly, if we understand nature as exceeding society and yet maintain that we too are nature, then nature must not be reduced to its instrumental value or construed as a means for human progress. Reducing it in this way risks prolonging the very logic of domination that underlies many attempts to justify ecologically devastating activity. Instead, we must concede that when we dominate and damage nature, we may be harming something that both precedes and exceeds us, and therefore may have the status of a legitimate other in its own right that demands some sort of ethical response. We might, for example, conclude that we ought to protect or respect nature for reasons that are not articulated exclusively in relation to human beings. So those of you who are interested in indigenous philosophy or the rights of nature will hear some resonance with that first implication. But secondly, if we understand human subjectivity and by extension society as grounded in this same nature that also exceeds us, then nature is not just other, but grounds our existence as subjects and thus as a part of us. Adorno himself even says, and this is kind of bold for Adorno, perhaps unexpected, Ich selber bin ja ein Stück Natur. So I myself am also a part of nature. And so at minimum, we can consider our bodies, of course, our instincts and drives as constitutive aspects of ourselves to which we as reflective subjects must relate in some way. Thus, we must also concede that when we damage nature, we risk damaging ourselves and, at the same time, something more than ourselves. It should be noted that such a position does not necessitate the reduction of human subjectivity to nature. I will argue quite the opposite, namely that human subjectivity is simultaneously rooted in and transcends nature, at minimum in its exercise of human freedom and ability to take responsibility for itself and its actions in a way that is not reducible to natural processes. This is another one of Peter's paradoxes, right? How at the same time we are nature, but we're more than or different from the other beings of nature in our capacity to take responsibility for our actions, which is rooted in our freedom. So I do this notably by bringing Schelling's theory of the role of nature in the development of subjectivity, which we heard a little bit about yesterday, through the exercise of freedom, into productive dialogue with Adorno's view of nature as pre-subjective. Okay, so in the remainder of this talk, with help from Schelling and Adorno, I will proceed in 2 steps, which again you can see on the screen. So step 1 delineates 3 philosophical approaches to nature beyond the human that could plausibly ground an argument against total domination or careless destruction of nature. These approaches avoid 2 pitfalls. First, subordinating nature entirely to human constructs, whether the concept, symbolic order, or society itself. And second, assuming a direct, unmediated access to nature in experience. Each position affirms that, and you can see the A, B, C there. A, nature exceeds the concept or conceptuality and therefore is irreducible to subjectivity or society. B, subjectivity is grounded in nature. And C, our access to nature is always mediated. This ontological approach to nature has important implications regarding our responsiveness and responsibility towards nature, inherent to which is the recognition, to quote Adorno, that, Adorno, the separation of subject and object is both real and semblance. So interestingly, through Adorno, we get back into this debate about the subject-object divide. So this approach to nature, I argue, grounds the basis of moral responsiveness to nature and human responsibility for the ecological crisis. So these 3 approaches, and this is my, I guess, part of my thesis or speculative move here, that these 3 approaches form a continuum. So the 3 positions on a continuum are listed there. And these approaches range from the positively speculative to the negatively determined. And basically, again, part of my goal here is to make, and we're in a session on German Romanticism in part, to make very highly speculative positions, like Schelling's Naturphilosophie. So positions that venture to say a hell of a lot about what nature is, compatible with the positions that are very, very careful about saying nature is anything, because every time we say what nature is, we resort back to human concepts and we resort back to social and cultural mediated ways of viewing or perceiving nature. And these seem like oppositions, but I want to say that there's a continuum of positions that allow us to speak about this nature as other, but nature as grounding at the same time. So the first position is what we talked about, those of you who were in the seminar yesterday. In that seminar, so Schelling's early speculative dynamic conceptual approach to nature, or his Naturphilosophie. The second approach is the late Schelling's speculative account of existence beyond rationality. Some of you in the room may have heard of positive philosophy, but it's this position. And the third position is Adorno's negative approach to nature, centered on the non-identical, or in other words, the nature as that which is negatively other to whatever we say is subjectivity or, yeah, we could say consciousness even. So taken together, these 3 positions, as I'm arguing, can be put into productive dialogue with other frameworks that fulfill similar criteria in different registers. For example, as I've proposed, certain indigenous relational ontologies. And once this ontological continuum is established in my talk, in a second step, which again you can see there, I turn to the question of what kind of critical self-relation, including our conscious relationship to nature considered as part of us, could productively inform debates regarding responsibility in the context of the ecological crisis. So here I introduce actually a 4th position that also fulfills the 3 aforementioned criteria, but that focuses on describing the structure and dynamicity of the subject's relationship to nature, thus putting an extra focus there on criterion B. So this position is the middle Schelling's account of nature as the unconscious ground of personality, read together with Adorno's view of nature as pre-subjective. This position understands subjectivity and by extension freedom as both grounded in nature but also as transcending nature. I argue that maintaining a concept of nature that meets these criteria is the condition for conceiving of the subject's relationship to nature, and this is important, as also a critical relation to oneself and one's practices as a natural and morally responsible human being. So here's the truth, right? I spent 2 months at the Institute for Social Research in Germany, full of people that want to say that self-relationality is a lie. It's a lie. All those things you think about yourself as a spiritual being who connects with the earth, all of it is your own egoistic, self-assuredness of the uniqueness of yourself as a little being who can just make the world what it is for you. And the truth is, you're in a historical social context mediated by late stage capitalism that tells you all kinds of things about yourself or gives you all kinds of contextual possibilities for your perception of your own self-determination, but you're a hell of a lot less self-determined than you think. That's the kind of world I was in for a few months. And I was thinking in this context, they're onto a lot, right? I think they're correct, actually, about a lot of it. But I refuse to give up on the idea of self-relationality. I do think that what we believe about ourselves and the types of beings we are and our journeys to self-realization, if you want to put it that way, while we maybe overestimate the extent to which they are our own, they're really important. And I do think that if we're going to do something about the ecological crisis, we have to talk about and think about the types of beings in the ecological crisis that we are and who we are. And I think it matters if the development of my personality involves lifestyle changes and involves, I don't know, a commitment to being a type of person that does not commit explicitly and intentionally ecologically devastating activity. And even if that's not going to get me all the way, I was dead set on my time at the Institute in arguing that this is important. And then I realized I just came back full circle and that I'm just not willing to give up Schelling's concept of personality in the freedom essay. So overcoming inner necessity or overcoming that which seems to close you in and determine you in a way that brings you out of yourself and in relation to others to come back to yourself. So, I mean, that's why I think we need this step 2. And it goes further than most critical theory is willing to go. But I hope that it helps us here today talk about the relevance of somebody like Schelling for the ecological crisis today. And beyond that, I hope to hear from you folks as well, what resources you see in any of these arguably 4 positions that could meaningfully supplement arguments in current ecological discourse in which you're involved. So especially those that may try to defend, as most German romanticists do, nature is existing beyond the social. I don't know if anybody here is involved with critical theory, but one of the typical critical theory problems that I know you guys face regularly in your discussions, and I'm speaking especially about the students in the field school here, is the productive relationship of responsibility to political action and the relationship of theory to praxis, especially in deciding what to do in relation to the world and right now Newfoundland burning. Like what to actually do from all of this theory and what kind of path to take out of all of this stuff that we're studying and talking about, which is going to be subject to relentless critique, as it should be. Any blueprint for a better society or a way out of the ecological crisis absolutely should be subject to intense criticism because of all kinds of issues that I know we could talk about ad nauseum regarding power relations and hierarchies and misguidedness and so on. But still, we want to be able to say something about what we can do in this kind of world of capitalist-driven destruction of nature in which we live, and how that kind of context conditions subjects, conditions us as consumers. We're all consumers. I don't know if we all admit that, but we are all consumers in late-stage capitalism. So what do we do? And I hope that some of these positions at least help ground a sort of minimally normative direction about how we might think about at least our own activity and our own personal development in this context. So I take it many of you are interested in linking subjectivity and sociality within nature in different ways, and to critically identify the human sources of environmental destruction and the forms of subjectivity that it produces. And I think this may be something critical theory really adds, right, is this analysis of the types of subjectivity and the types of freedom, let's say, the types of choices that are even possible in our current capitalist society. What can we do? What can we choose? And so while theorizing more explicitly about this and about the relationship of critical theory to concrete political agency is beyond the scope of my talk, I really am eager to hear how you think some of these points might contribute to the ever-present tension, as I mentioned, between theory and praxis. So let's explore what I'm calling this ontological continuum that might help us dialogue about nature as both more than us and a part of us. The first position, which is intensely familiar to all of you by now, is Schelling's Naturphilosophie. So basically, I'm just going to summarize very shortly some of what I said yesterday and what we talked about in relation to Schelling. So as you know, the young Schelling affirms the self-generativity of nature as the productive activity of opposing forces. During his philosophy in this early period, nature is described as a dynamic, living, self-organizing system, as again you all know, and nature is more than its conceptualization because it is infused with spirit, which can be understood as the principle of generative activity that gives rise to life and ultimately of self-consciousness. Does anyone remember the quote, the Schelling quote yesterday about nature and spirit? Do you remember it? Yeah, it's on the slide. So giving it away, nature should be spirit made visible, and spirit the invisible nature. So nature's unconscious productivity exceeds its products and gives rise to human consciousness itself, which is also a bit of what Sean was talking about today. So this fulfills criterion A. So for the young Schelling, nature exceeds the concept and is irreducible to human or social constructs. And you can see those three criterion on the side of the slide there, right? That I think characterize each position. So nature exceeds conceptuality, subjectivity is grounded in nature, and access to nature is always mediated. And I'm going to go through each of these positions with regards to those three criteria. So regarding criterion B, Schelling claims that spirit in us is identified with, this is a quote, nature outside of us. So reflective subjectivity is the highest expression of nature's own freedom and productivity. Human thought itself is a part of nature, for in fact nothing is outside of nature, and self-consciousness is nature becoming fully aware of itself. This continuity, often described as a naturalization of consciousness, could form at least a minimum degree of moral responsibility in considering our interaction with other beings in the living contingent system of nature on which we depend. As for criterion C, Schelling is clear that our access to nature is mediated. In 1797, he acknowledges that we only know nature by first separating ourselves from it and then accessing it through reflection. So again, this may be familiar to you from the picture that Sean was describing about what happens with this separation between the subject and the object and how it brings us then to speculatively investigate what nature is. So the limitations of this rational approach, of course, that Schelling himself puts forth, would later be criticized by no other than Schelling himself, who saw its tendency either to overdetermine the object or leave the origin of rationality itself unaccounted for. So that's the first position. Now we'll move to the second position, the late Schelling. So while the early Naturphilosophie explores the experience of nature, especially through the emerging natural sciences and undergirded by a Spinozist view, which we again talked about, natura naturans, right, of unconscious productive activity, which is immanent but not reducible to all of visible nature, or natura naturata, nature's products. Schelling later argues that this approach remains confined within a priori rationality. After 1831, he critiques the Naturphilosophie for failing to account for brute existence itself, so the fact of existence, insofar as, quote Schelling, Naturphilosophie never transcends thinking, for it is a science that is thoroughly immanent, never transcendent, and a priori. That's Schelling in the Paulus Nachschrift. So thus, when productively drawing on its dynamic view of spirit as immanent to nature in the wake of the ecological crisis, we must also take seriously the late Schelling's demand for a different theoretical approach to nature that does justice to the very fact that something is, which he conceptualizes as das reine das, rather than only asking what nature is. In this way, the late Schelling affirms the contingency of all of our concepts of nature and even being itself. This gives rise to a second philosophical method, one which Schelling describes as per posterius, taking its starting point from what exists and then attempting to explain events in their historical situatedness. Schelling calls this positive philosophy, which ventures to speak without absolute certainty about what is literally unvordenklich, or unthinkable, or unprethinkable. So here he anticipates Adorno's claim that the given is the scandalon of idealism, says Adorno, that which idealism in hypostasizing subjectivity cannot fully subsume. Similarly, Adorno notes the places where subjective reason senses subjective contingency, the primacy of the object shimmers through. That in the object which is not a subjective addition, end quote. There he sounds unbelievably Schellingian, at least in the sense of the late Schelling. So both thinkers thus affirm here criterion A. Nature exceeds the concept and is not subordinated to subjectivity. On top of this, they both affirm that reason can encounter its own contingency, or its inability to fully dominate or subsume nature, which I am here interpreting through the existence of the object and the primacy of the object for Adorno. So the late Schelling's approach to nature also fulfills criterion C. He underscores that even his revised second epistemological method cannot secure unmediated access to nature. While non-deductive, it still remains speculative. The attempt to definitively know nature's origin is destined to fail, and this failure is central. Our epistemological stance toward nature must be fallible, responsive, non-totalizing, and be informed by the admission that our access to nature is always mediated by the principles, operations, and concepts that we have at our disposal. For Schelling, recognizing our dependency on a ground we never fully master or control means engaging in a critical self-relation to what conditions and implicates our decisions. As the middle Schelling, to whom I will turn in a moment, made clear, freedom entails an existential relation to what precedes, exceeds, and in a sense determines us. A view of responsibility grounded not in mastery, but in humility toward nature and history. Somebody said today we need to be humble. So this position resonates, of course, with that. So regarding criterion B here, Schelling insists that subjectivity is not self-grounding, but emerges from this pre-reflective ground, which he associates with nature, and that can never be made fully present. The subject is thus constituted by a split, we talked about it earlier, that arises from an unconscious natural ground it cannot fully appropriate, and its freedom lies in the never complete task of relating to this ground and discovering how it is determined by it. In this way, the late Schelling maintains the middle period's insight that human existence is distinctly personal, dynamic, fractured, and grounded in nature, but irreducible to nature in the exercise of freedom. So now position 3, Adorno and the non-identical. I hope you can see in a way how on this continuum we're moving towards like being able to say less about nature actually, right? So the first is that, and I think that's what we need to keep in mind when we commit to not being dogmatic, especially when revisiting the German Romantics, that like the more you say about nature, in a way, if you're talking about nature as more than the human, you got to always watch out for becoming more dogmatic. I was going to say the more dogmatic you become, but of course that's up to debate. But nevertheless, there is a serious question here about how and what we can responsibly say about nature beyond the human. So position 3, Adorno and the non-identical. Adorno's concept of nature can be understood through his account of the primacy of the object and its non-identity with the subject. His argument that nature exceeds the concept, criterion A, begins with the claim that thinking always attempts to bring objective reality under the categories of identity. So you're going to sense a lot of Kant and Hegel in the background of these claims if you have that background. So because of this, there is always a gap between our concepts and what is. And this gap is the site of non-identity. And Adorno insists that the concept of nature must account for the non-identical relation between subject and object. While we always relate to nature through subjective categories, for Adorno, the object retains primacy. Here is a quote from Adorno. According to its own concept, the object is not so thoroughly dependent upon a subject as subject is dependent upon an object, end quote. Nature thus exceeds every attempt to grasp it. It is not just what we think it to be. In this, Adorno shares with Schelling a resistance to conceptual totalization and a defense of nature's real existence beyond its identity with the concept and even beyond its social mediation. Since nature cannot be fully dominated or conceptually captured, it preserves the possibility of a future in which domination has not fully triumphed. This negative space between human subjects and the object is not and may never be reconciled. But in that very resistance lies the possibility of transformation. Whether this opens up real hope for a more humane future of deliberate ends in social relations or not, social relations not characterized by domination, remains an open and pressing question. But it is noteworthy that Adorno himself hopes for a potential, again, quote Adorno, agreement between human beings and things. What is desirable, he suggests, is a peace achieved between human beings, as well as between them and their other. Peace is the state of differentiation without domination, with the differentiated participating in each other. That is wildly optimistic for Adorno. When I read that quote, I was like, is he really saying that what we desire is peace? Peace achieved between human beings and their other? Peace in a state of differentiation without domination? This is what I would call the messianic impulse of Adorno. I don't have time to go there now, but it is interesting to note in the context of this massively critical picture that I'm presenting. Because critique can be a little bit stifling, right? As we all know. It's always the criticism of critique is that it doesn't allow you to propose anything. It doesn't allow you to say anything in the end because everything is subject to relentless critique. Okay, so this account clearly meets criterion C as well. For Adorno, there is no direct access to nature. This is obvious. Our relation to it is always mediated. Adorno's focus on the mediation of the object by the subject is, on all accounts, stronger than Schelling's. He asserts that when the separation between subject and object is firmly maintained, it, quote, becomes ideology, and the mind, quote, arrogates to itself the status of being absolutely independent, which it is not, end quote. The result is domination. One more Adorno quote, once radically separated from the object, subject reduces the object to itself. Subject swallows object, forgetting how much it is object itself. And this refusal to acknowledge its own objective nature, and in this refusal, the subject instates an illusion of an unmediated separation between subject and object, which originated from the attempt to master nature. Finally, criterion B is fulfilled through Adorno's insistence that both subject and object resist full definition. To define itself is to subjectively, by means of a rigidly applied concept, capture something objective, no matter what it may be in itself. So that is the trap, right? That all definitions are trying to capture the objective. So the second you define something, you limit the object, right? So the object then grounds the subjective not by becoming transparent to it, but by exceeding its conceptual grasp. This is crucial for developing a Schellingian-inspired concept of personality that does not reduce subjectivity to abstraction. The object cannot be fully captured by thought, yet it remains the ground of all subjectivity and all thinking. Okay, I know it's hard after lunch, but this is where it gets really good, in my opinion. I sense like a low energy in the room, which is, let's go. Okay, we're going to merge middle Schelling and Adorno through this notion of self-relationality and nature as unconscious ground, personality, and self-responsibility. Okay. So I've argued thus far that nature is both other to us and we are a part of nature. I want to now turn to the middle Schelling's proposal that understanding nature as the unconscious ground of personality enables a conception of critical self-relation that is both grounded in and transcends nature. This concept of nature fulfills criteria A, B, and C. But as I said at the very opening of my talk, I think it offers especially important insights for B, so subjectivity is grounded in nature, particularly when read alongside Adorno's view of nature as pre-subjective. So by integrating a theory of nature into his arguably psychodynamic theory of personality, Schelling describes moral responsibility as rooted in our complex relation to nature as ground. This shifts the moral question from what are we obliged to do to how do we become the kind of people who do not contribute to the fires, who do not contribute to ecological demise. And I think that this shift in question with the middle Schelling is crucial. This shift from something that sounds a little bit normatively overdetermined, even deontological. What do we have to do? What do we do? What must I do? What laws do I have to follow? To how do we become the kind of people that don't want to do those things? The kind of people that want to be otherwise. So in Schelling's middle period, nature is reconfigured from a merely site of dynamic productivity to the unconscious, necessary, non-rational ground of individuation. And in this sense, ground becomes the principle of egoity. The ground is nature as internalized and individuating, the basis for the emergence of individual personality as such. Thus, the subject is not just consciousness in general, but a personality shaped by its unique relation to the unconscious ground that is the condition of its own individuation. In analyzing the one-sidedness of the structures of subjectivity, Adorno, in fact, fascinating thing that jumped out at me on the page when I read Adorno's essay on subject and object, great essay, if you have the chance to read it, something that totally jumped out to me. Adorno makes a reference to Schelling. And it's not one of these ambiguous critical theory kind of waffly references. It's a positive reference. And here's what he says about Schelling. No concept of the subject can have the element of individual humanity, what Schelling called egoity, separated from it in thought. Without any reference to it, subject would lose all significance. Subject needs to be grounded in a natural principle that it has some individuating factor for our own egoity or self-distinction. So while Adorno foregrounds the social and historical formation of subjectivity, his view complements Schelling by affirming that the subject's natural grounding is pre-subjective, prior to conscious self-awareness. Together, Schelling and Adorno articulate a subject that is simultaneously rooted in nature, but also capable of some form of transcendence. So continuing with this line, for Schelling, nature is an inner unconscious part of the self as well, or the ground of existence. It is comprised of impulses, drives, and tendencies that constitute an inner necessity. This ground is not to be suppressed, but embraced as the precondition for individuality and moral agency. Freedom arises at the juncture of ground, considered as nature, and existence, considered as spirit, as the capacity to relate reflectively and productively to this inner necessity. Moral agency involves ordering one's conscious subjectivity by subordinating drives which are repressed, that determine us in ways that are, so subordinating it in ways that contribute to the good. So evil is understood then in this context as a retreat into the ground without transcendence, a turning inward of egoity against itself. Here, a question remains whether Adorno could help us to interpret these drives and their repression as socially mediated, and whether Schelling's advocation for a form of self-mastery, namely an ongoing mastery of one's natural ground for an Adornian, presupposes too much potential self-transparency. So here it is again. Do we need to talk about the social mediation of that self-relationality in a way that Schelling in 1809 does not, on the one side? And then on the other side, does that kind of self-relation propose too much self-transparency? And can we say anything about self-mastery or a kind of relationality to oneself in this way without just succumbing to these critiques that are based in social and critical analyses? So nature and freedom are thus not opposed, but inseparable. Freedom depends on being grounded in a finite resistant nature. The subject can rise above nature in moral action, which Schelling closely associates with our freedom to choose, but never fully escapes dependence on it. Freedom is thus presupposed and transforms nature, producing a subject neither completely determined nor a detached mind, but grounded and thus mediated by nature, while rising above it in the exercise of freedom and thus the assumption of responsibility. So taken together, Schelling and Adorno thus offer us a framework uniquely situated to critically analyze our relations to nature and to ourselves in the midst of ecological crisis. This position fulfills all three criteria mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So again, they're still there. A, nature's irreducibility to the subject. B, subjectivity grounded in nature. C, mediation of all access to nature. But more than that, it describes subjectivity as dynamic, grounded in an unconscious nature and yet capable of more critical moral self-reflection. In my opinion, this allows us a path or forges a path to improving our relations to nature and to each other as linked with a critical relation to ourselves and our practices. So, a couple of tensions and challenges before I come to my conclusion. So before I conclude, it will be no doubt clear to some of you that I have largely avoided a potentially unresolvable tension on exactly what inner nature is for Adorno and why it is not the same as inner nature understood as ground in Schelling. Could it simply be an unresolvable tension that nature is a constitutive part of subjectivity for Schelling, but we are only a part of nature for Adorno? If Adorno's notion of inner nature is the historically and socially mediated psyche, then it would seem that the psyche is not just nature, but rather already is a distorted self-relation. That is the challenge. And I don't know if it's surmountable, to be honest. But if this is the case, then with Adorno, we can still maintain that there is something inside of oneself to which we don't have access, but still has some sort of role in the subjects we become. The non-identical quality of the psyche means that while we can never completely, for Adorno, master or control it, we can still critically analyze the patterns it follows, for example, of repression, and the consequences for our relationship to nature and to each other. I don't have time to further elaborate on that, but I welcome your ideas and comments because it really is a challenge in bringing these two thinkers into dialogue. And so one final point, it is also possible that the body could link Adorno and Schelling by serving as a crucial mediator between inner and outer nature. So these terms are more critical theory Adorno terms, inner nature, outer nature, and the body is the material condition, of course, of human individuation and self-relationality, so it could be one of the missing links here. The body is, of course, also socialized, but irreducible to sociality or subjectivity, as Adorno makes clear from his analyses of pain and especially physical needs. And while going deeper into this point is again beyond the scope of the talk, it should be noted that because the body is the site of human suffering, it is thus a point of resistance from which one can detect and begin to critique conditions and systems that cause unnecessary suffering. Adorno writes quite famously in Negative Dialectics, again, quote from Adorno, "The physical moment tells our knowledge that suffering ought not to be, that things should be different." Okay, so the conclusion. In closing, Schelling and Adorno both call for rethinking the subject's relation to nature, and yet their approaches differ in important ways. Schelling grounds personality and moral agency in a split between unconscious ground and conscious existence, which operates within a stable metaphysical framework in which the subject can choose between good and evil, with evil choices characterized by an egoistic retreat back into one's ground. But this theory risks oversimplifying the complex mediated relationship between nature and society. Adorno, on the other hand, offers a historically and socially nuanced account, revealing domination within subjectivity and objectivity, though his critique may lack an adequate account of agency, and with it, self-relationality, especially in the wake of the ecological crisis. On the other hand, while Schelling's focus on self-relation risks a kind of individualism, combining it with Adorno's social perspective, in my opinion, could enrich our understanding for how self-relation is conditioned and sometimes obscured. In general, thematizing self-relationality in relation to nature could help us better understand our role in ecological destruction. On my reading, this synthesis of Schelling and Adorno demands that we engage in critical self-examination that neither flees into escapist transcendence nor resigns itself to complacent acceptance, but is characterized by a constant, reflective struggle to become the kinds of subjects who actively resist ecological destruction. In this light, our responsiveness to nature is not merely affective or contemplative, but constitutive of subjectivity itself, anchored in an ontological ground that is at once natural and potentially, if Adorno can successfully inform Schelling, historically and socially mediated. Ecological responsibility, in turn, emerges not as an external imposition or abstract ideal, but as a transformative relation internal to the formation of subjectivity and the concept of nature itself. In taking external nature seriously in relation to a theory of the subject, I am asking, could there be a moment of orientation towards ecological action in the moment of self-reflection? So to sum up, Schelling helps us consider external nature as related to inner nature and subjectivity, while Adorno provides the historical and social mediation of nature and subjectivity that Schelling arguably lacks. And I hope that some of my further work will explore how ecological, feminist, and indigenous philosophies might enrich or challenge this framework, ensuring that our understanding of nature and subjectivity remain connected and understood pluralistically while demanding moral responsiveness in the face of the ongoing ecological crisis. So thank you very much for your attention. Mm-hmm. Do I do that? Stop share. Okay. Can I close the Zoom?
Yes.
Oh, just
Yeah.
hold this. Okay.
Sure.
Yep. So I guess my question is about the third claim about access to nature is always mediated. So instrumental rationality, the way Adorno and Horkheimer talk about it sometimes is that it's particular to capitalism. So taking Marx's labor theory of value, where you see that abstraction entails the reduction of use values to exchange value. But if instrumental rationality is a product of capitalism, then does that mean there's other forms of rationality that are possible that don't engage in this process of abstraction that fails to see objects and their particular features? And sometimes maybe that, my understanding of his sort of view of aesthetics comes close to this kind of other type of rationality. So I was just curious if you had thoughts about that. Or
Yeah, thanks for that. Certainly. And I guess, like, again, one of the things that attracted me to Adorno and Horkheimer in these contexts in the first place is that they don't give up on rationality. They don't give up on even the Enlightenment project. They don't give up on morality. And yet they subject it to relentless critique, and they show what's happened and what's the fate of the Enlightenment project, what's the fate of reason. And yet there's still a commitment to freedom. There's still a commitment to reason in some sort of a way. In terms of the other forms of rationality possible, I usually go to Horkheimer's Eclipse of Reason and the account of subjective reason there, and the idea that, okay, what we need to acknowledge with reason and rationality is that there are always subjective uses of it. There's always ways we make use of rational decision making. And that we need a return to some sort of this is how I read it, also in the dialectic of enlightenment, Kantianism, in the sense that we identify that we can't use, for example, people as means. We have to see people as ends in themselves, and we have to identify ends that our reason moves towards and be more explicit about those ends. The challenge becomes how to identify those ends in, first of all, pluralistic context, and second of all, like in relation to the fact that they'll be endlessly scrutinized and open to critique. But nevertheless, there's a subjective use of reason, which I think kind of counteracts, or at least provides an alternative way forward, over and against instrumental rationality.
so with that mediating nature, like
yes, but could you say a bit more about the way you're thinking about it? Like,
well, because you're saying access.
oh, yeah. It's always mediated, yes, but by that, I mean that mostly as like an epistemological claim, right? That we just cannot know nature beyond, like, we can't, once we, like the Adorno quote I read, once we say something about nature and do this definitive act, we are like shrinking it. We're confining it in some sort of a way. And so we don't have an unmediated access to nature in at least a discursive sense. But this is also why I open up this possibility that potentially the body could be one of the ways that we try to say something. But again, even when I say something, but we try to talk about what is in between inner and outer nature, and what is between, I suppose, like, you could say the realm of the symbolic or the discursive and reality itself. But again, the issue is when we try to talk about it, we end up back in the same problems. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Kyla. That was really, really good work. Hard work, I know. Yeah, years of work, really. So it's a major enterprise you're on. But something that occurred to me, it concerns the mediation issue as maybe the insurmountable obstacle. And, Hegel doesn't come up enough in this paper for my liking, because it seems to me to be the real fundamental problem. And this issue that nature, this claim, we have no unmediated access to nature is so totally un-Schellingian. Now, we might want to say, oh, well, we have an immediate experience of nature, but I think that kind of simplistic view, especially after hearing the Schleiermacher stuff, really isn't faithful to the difference. I think the problem seems to me that on the Hegelian line, we're still too Cartesian. So we're still dealing with something that isn't nature, namely culture or concepts or ideology or something. So even if we conceded, let's say, that all of our access to whatever we call nature is mediated by culture, language, ideology, community, the question arises, what is culture, language, ideology, community, if not nature? It is, as you yourself said multiple times, it is spirit, which is invisible nature. So we have visible nature, if you like, mediated by invisible nature, but it's all nature all the way down. There's no place for a spirit-nature dichotomy in Schelling, such as is pretty clear in Hegel, and it seems even clearer in Adorno. What do you think?
I think that part of the reason that I drew this ontological continuum through the first 2/3 of the talk was because I think that this is an open debate regarding how much we can say, let's say, culture, ideology, community, even structure or organization, to go with the early Schelling, is nature. And I think it's notoriously difficult to define nature for Adorno. Like he doesn't really define it, and the way that I've been operating with it is almost synonymous with object, right? And when you say object for Adorno, what you are just saying is that there, like, and this is where I do think there's a link with Schelling, that there's some sort of a reine das that precedes all of those things, but once it gets entangled and enmeshed with all of those things, this is, I think, the crucial claim. Those things become part maybe nature, part whatever, however you want to describe them, concept, part discursivity, part social is the word that he uses, right? So that the social and the natural end up so intertwined that none of them are pure in any sort of way anymore, but rather they're entangled together. Now, if you want to say that in some sense, nature, culture, and ideology, community are nature or natural insofar as they exist, and thereby they're entwined with however we describe them, or with subjectivity, I think that'd be fine for Adorno to do this kind of hybridization. But his issue would become when you start to naturalize them as facts that are not mediated, not, let's say, even socially mediated. Yeah. Even the concept of culture for Adorno is so socially mediated and discursively mediated that there's no way to he's very, very critical of saying anything is natural, because for him, the natural becomes social. He's got this essay on natural history, right? And the social becomes natural. And you're making way too dogmatic of a claim to just say it's natural, full stop. When you say you're natural, you're saying it's social.
But that is what you said, though. You said, invisible spirits.
Yeah, but I said that for early Schelling.
Yes, that's right. But it's for Schelling all the way through. There's no sense in which the word, the concept, the understanding is some event outside of nature. It might be some kind of diminishment of the fullness, but it doesn't bring us into a different place. There's no dichotomy there, such that mediation would present a problem to be solved. I don't think.
But don't you think then you could still frame it the way I've done, like the first half of this talk on an ontological, I'm calling it an ontological continuum, but on a continuum of positions where someone who's a true, like Fabian Freihagen, like a true blue negativist Adornian would say, okay, you want to speculate on all of that and say Schelling says it? Fine. But those are claims that Schelling made coming out of Kant in the 19th century or 18th century as mediated by XYZ. And it's one possible historical understanding of many of nature that has a hell of a lot of speculative baggage. But if you want to experiment with that, fine. But for an Adornian, I just think it's overdetermined.
Yeah, I think that's because there's this fundamental cleft. We're dealing with it with the Hegel-Schelling divide. And it goes back to the idea of the word. And it's, whether the word displaces being or whether the word is the perfection and expression of being. And I think on one line, you have basically Hegel through Frankfurt School to deconstruction. And on the other line, you have the alternative, really, which is a much more naturalistic humanism, which isn't to say that it's all good, because there are forms of evil nature.
But here's
Would
what
be
I would
good.
say. Careful, Adorno is not Schelling, and
Yeah.
all of or Adorno is not Hegel, and all of his claims about the primacy of the object and how the object exceeds the subject, and that there is, I read that quote there, if something goes something like, subjectivity requires the object, is predicated upon the object, and that when push comes to shove, object is always more than subject. This is where he's not Hegelian, and he criticizes this beginning and becoming of Hegel. So does that, my question systematically there is, can Schelling's reine das be put into some sort of like first position, like productive relationship with the object and the primacy of the object in Adorno as a sort of putting forth of the fact of existence that you have to work from and that doesn't allow subjectivity to be blown up into everything?